And welcome everybody. So the as Sue arrives in, let us begin with prayer. Loving God, we return from a bit of a hiatus to dive right into the meat of the last book of the Bible. Be with us tonight in exploring symbols that are strange to us, that we sometimes try or have a hard time getting our heads around, and yet give us a sense of what John of Patmos was trying to convey. Help us learn something new, right? In Christ's name, amen. I am going to just grab myself in my jacket over here. I've got a fisherman's friend. I've got the last vestiges of the cough of what I had for the past little while.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, Ian.
All right.
Don't see him.
All right. So we just get to, it's been 2 weeks since we were through here last, and wanted to do a little bit of a, no, I didn't want to do that. I actually started at the end. Now we're going to start at the beginning. There we go. So we have today is week 4. And just in terms of where we've been, of course, we've had essentially 2 sessions worth of introduction. And then 2 weeks ago, we did the letters to the 7 churches, bit of a break last week. So we actually started diving into the text. We're going to keep that going. And if you happen to have a Bible handy, you may need it, but we have. Let's see. But we'll be able to bring this up as we need to. And this week we are dealing with the symbols specifically of scrolls, trumpets, and bowls. That's a broad thing, but the reality is that we're actually dealing with chapter 4 through 16, but we're very specifically leaving out the middle section, because that we're going to deal with that next week. One of the things when working with Revelation is that because of how it understands time, some of these symbols are cyclical, and going through Revelation in a linear way, in some respects, is a little off. I mean, we tend to read books in a linear way, but Revelation is not a linear book in that sense. But what I want to try and do is demonstrate how specifically the scrolls, trumpets, and bowls are the brackets around what we're going to be dealing with next week, which is the core revelation of the book. So, and of course, next week is the actual pulling back of the curtain, and then we deal with the vision of ultimate hope, and then week 7 is more of a stepping back now, as we've gone through the book, to actually talk about responsible use and interpretation of Revelation in the 21st century. So, and yes, it still says November 13th. That should say December 13th. So, going to come back. A couple things to remember. This is actually reviewing back to the introduction briefly about reminder of symbols, numbers, and the language itself. Is that all the symbols and the language and everything else within Revelation itself is very nuanced. It is. Well, it has some allegorical elements to it, that something corresponds to something else. The symbols themselves are much more evocative, and so while they may be pointing to something, they can also have different layers of meaning beyond that. We talked in depth, for example, of the symbol of Babylon, and how at least in the context of Revelation, that Babylon is used to describe the threat of the external empire, but specifically the Roman Empire. But it can also mean any like the overall any imperial power. So in that sense, that's where its longevity can come into place. Also, the numbers themselves are symbolic. Every time a number shows up, it is symbolic. It does not mean something actual literal. Even when a point where you say that, you know, a river that is approximately three feet deep, that is still that modifier is still symbolic. And then, of course, there's the odd language structure is also driven by numeric and symbolic elements, like phrases that are 7 and 12, between 7 and 12 syllables long, for example, or groups of 7, or things like that. And unfortunately, most of that stuff we're just not going to see when we're reading it in English. That you really have to be able to read Koine Greek to be able to pick that up. I'm not expecting you to read Koine Greek. And so that's not part of the lesson. Okay, but to borrow a line from Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. So last week, or the last session, we were talking about this, the 7 churches, and how, while everything in Revelation is symbolic, and it's the gathering, this kind of gathering of the church together, we are also there's also multiple layers upon this. Reminder: we tend to talk and would prefer things explained to us in propositional language, whereas Revelation uses pictorial language. And what is going to kind of come into play today is that this line here between diachronic and synchronic in terms of how time is perceived. It's impressionistic. It's not exact logical, but it is intended to convey emotion more than a logical proposition. So, and of course, last week we talked about the structure, and we dealt with section 1 of last time we met, specifically the 7 letters to the 7 churches. And now we're going to be getting into, as we move into this, as the God judges the great city, and so we'll get into this. Now, these categorizations are from Eugene Boring's Revelation commentary. There's no titles in Revelation that actually say this specifically, but this is how Eugene Boring kind of framed it, of this introduction, this kind, and then the middle section, and then redemption, this speaking to, judging, and then redeeming. Now, of course, last time I took you on a fancy tour on Google Earth. This is a lot more. This one is a lot more simple. Though we have Patmos here, and then Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, and you have this basically walking route into Asia Minor, what is now modern day Turkey. So that's where we're at. So now, one of the things before we get into this, we need to actually speak a little bit about, we need to be honest, the imagery in Revelation, a lot of it is quite violent. And the question is as Christians, how do we reconcile this? And it can pose a problem, but here's some things to help us understand it. because of course you actually have this, some of these images specifically presented of Jesus, who, at least as far as the Gospels are concerned and the various teachings, are very, very peaceful, and yet some of these seem to be much more quasi-militaristic in some respects. Well, not in some respects, in many ways. And so, how do we reconcile this, the Prince of Peace, with these images in Revelation? And so, here's some things to remember. Now, again, I'm reliant on some of Eugene Boring's work. I found this as a very helpful guide. Is that there's a couple of elements that, first off, there's the reality that John is speaking to, and it's a situation from John's perspective of suffering and threat of cultural assimilation, of losing one's identity to the majority empire. Remember how small a community Christians were at this time. Also, it's a certain use of traditions, specifically some Old Testament traditions and how those work. I'll get into each of these lines. I'll give you a little bit more detail as we get to how he uses the language, how John uses the language. Is like everything in Revelation is deliberate. Unfortunately, sometimes we kind of get this message that in fact all Revelation is just a bad acid trip, just written down. It's not. It is a very deliberately written piece of literature, and therefore the choice of language that John uses is deliberate all the way through. And then, of course, you also have the actual theology, like John's theology. In other words, how John understands God's presence in and through the current situation. So let's talk about that experience of suffering to begin with. Is that John is experiencing suffering in present. He is in exile, at least at the point at which he's writing that introduction. Whether or not he wrote the introduction, like it's highly likely that he wrote the core, basically chapters 12 through 15 first, and then kind of expanded it out from there. And he speaks of his exile. So he's in exile, but it's not speculating about some suffering out there to come. It's what's happening right now. And of course, when one is suffering at the hands of an oppressive power, one can be like the brain can go to some pretty dark places. For example, Psalm 137, we read frequently, the by the waters of Babylon. And in fact, I think it was Verdi who actually created this rather majestic and setting to By the Waters of Babylon, which was ultimately a cry for freedom, which Psalm 137 is. But the part that we leave out about in Psalm 137, let me grab this one. I'm going to read. Is we have in Psalm 137, we have this opening lament. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On our willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? This is a psalm from the experience of the exile. And then it goes on, and and we like for the most part, we generally read up to verse 6 just fine. But then it then goes on to it gets angry. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy they shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy they shall be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. Advocating the killing of children in Psalm 137. That is an expression of anger that the brain can go to some pretty dark places. So, keep in mind that Revelation is there may be a certain element that, but the idea is that it's a cry for vengeance and wanting God's justice to be seen by all. Now, I have some significant problems with Psalm 137, specifically towards the end there, and I, typical of United Church ministers, we like to kind of edit out the violent imagery, but it's there, and we have to acknowledge that it's there. Now, the thing is, the images that John uses in Revelation, he did not simply conjure these out of thin air. These aren't just simply, like I said, this is not an acid trip. These images are all out there, and he's just pulling them in and mixing them together to create these images. And so where he's drawing from, he also is drawing from something called that scholars tend to refer to as a Near Eastern combat myth. And that is the story of, we have in various mythologies, in Greek mythology, in Babylonian mythology, in various others, of this kind of heavenly warfare and chaos, and then order being brought out of that chaos. I mean, even Genesis chapter 1 is an appropriation of this Near Eastern combat myth, but it's put into a very different context. And so you have this kind of framework, even though Revelation does not sound a lot like Genesis chapter 1. There's the inspiration is drawn from a similar space.
Good.
But the idea of order versus chaos, and that even in a time of war, there's always chaos at the edges, and yet in the Near Eastern combat myth, is ultimately chaos tries to assert itself and order wins. Ultimately, that's where this is going. And so, but quite often, good storytellers like to talk about that, like to describe and talk about that chaos, but it's ultimately moving towards a point of order. It also borrows from Jewish apocalyptic literature. I mean, Daniel, of course, being within the Bible itself, but there's also other traditions. And the idea of something new, and this is something that is actually quite a fairly common thing within the Old Testament. We just, unfortunately, we tend to miss it, is that the idea of moving towards something new is often compared to childbirth, of giving birth to the new. But for anybody who's experienced childbirth, it's not a painless experience. Okay, and I mean, I'm seeing some acknowledgements of that. I will say, having been witness to the birth of my 3 children, and at one point Sarah nearly ripping my arm off. I have a spectator's viewpoint of the birth pangs, but it's the idea is that something being born, but there are birth pangs, which is a painful experience, and can be a dangerous experience as well. Now, the other thing is, John is also using language from Scripture. Now, Brad, did you put your
Oh, yeah.
hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to chime in and say that's what epidurals are for, but never mind. I'll behave myself.
Yeah, well, Sarah only had an epidural once, and that was for Ian. And keep in mind, this is in a period pre-epidural. So we have, and of course, the language of Scripture itself. Quite often, if you read Revelation closely, a lot of the images there specifically reflect images from Exodus, and more specifically, the various Moses saying, "Let my people go," Pharaoh saying no, and then something happens, and there's this back and forth. I mean, sometimes it's referred to as the various the plagues of Egypt, but or more specifically, signs and wonders. And there are parallels to that within Revelation, not necessarily in direct, like lined up parallels. But there's very definitely callbacks, and a lot of the images. For example, rivers of blood is a callback to Exodus. That's a quickie. Okay, but by connecting the Roman emperor to Pharaoh, that we see this idea of it isn't just kind of God being randomly wrathful, but one of justice, of bringing a sense of justice and peace out of darkness and violence. And also in the language, keep in mind, it's also symbolic and metaphorical. Okay, none of the violent imagery is literal violence in the world in any point in Revelation 6 through 16. Okay, but the idea is that it shows that no tangible power on earth can compare with God's power. God at God's weakest is stronger than any mortal realm at its most powerful. But also, again, this is not objectifying, it's also confessional language as well. So the idea is that this is language from within inside the community. It's not set to describe something. It's intended to evoke, encourage, and inspire. And so it does not make conclusive or the ideas that hope for deliverance. I mean, curiously enough, if you look at the various, for example, let's pull this forward a bit. I'm always looking for current or at least different forms of apocalyptic language that has been used in ways that, like, last time I talked about American Pie, the song by Don McLean describing the music, basically the state of the music industry in roughly 1969. But at the same time, African American spirituals are almost universally apocalyptic in nature. But they also had a practical application that, for example, Follow the Drinking Gourd was a guide of telling people, that in the sky, there is this symbol that looks kind of like a drinking gourd. In other words, the Big Dipper. You follow the drinking gourd, that will point you north, that will get you to freedom. The Jordan River was a metaphor or a symbol for the Ohio River. You get across the Ohio River, you are in free states as opposed to slave states. And those kinds of things are this hope for deliverance that and some of Revelation's imagery found resonance within within the African slave community, and finding a way to move towards freedom. So there are those resonance, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in session 7. But the idea is that it's also intended. Remember how I said Revelation was intended to be heard, not read. You weren't supposed to go over it with a fine-tooth comb and a magnifying glass. You're supposed to scan, actually, and listen to it. And if anything, there's a musical quality to it. It's entirely possible that Revelation was intended to be sung. I mean, certainly our hymn books have taken that on, whether they realize that or not. The language of Revelation is very musical, and it also in music gives that sense of hope. The last little bit here is talking about John's theology, is that it's talking about justice, and the idea is that in not only that, that Christ, the presence of Christ transforms the experience into something. Well, I used a term using something like linguistic math. Like, for example, you have x squared, okay, and yet in the mathematical equation, you say like -1 multiplied will, whatever the value of x squared is, if you multiply it by -1, it inverts it. And so there is some of that linguistic math going on in Revelation. Hopefully you can see what this is, but keep in mind the presence of Christ in the middle of all this, at the beginning and at the end, that basically brackets that is a bracket around this. Also, there's a question as to are only some saved, or is everybody saved? Which is more a broader theological question. But in Revelation, curiously enough, we've got David just coming in to join us. Hi, David.
Hi.
So in Revelation, you have the Revelation leans much more into a universalist kind of idea that everyone, ultimately, everybody, that God redeems everybody. Because there's an interesting line that we often forget, and I know evangelicals often forget, is that the concept of an eternal hell, for example, is destroyed in Revelation. It actually, and in fact, one of our most beloved hymns, there is this line, "Death of death and hell's destruction." That's a line that's straight out of Revelation. And so there is also this sense of universal salvation that comes out of Revelation, that everybody, the entire world, is redeemed from evil's power. Now, granted, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's kind of dive into some more of these images now, because now we actually get to pull things out and to borrow a line from Bob Dylan, that we're knocking on heaven's door. Mind you, Guns N' Roses did a pretty decent cover of that song too, but here we are. What chapter 4 and 5 do is it sets the scene. Because what happens, we have at the very tail, at the very beginning of chapter 4, gotta make sure that I'm bringing it up right, is that after these 7 letters to the 7 churches, this invite, this gathering of the church together, and it said, "After this I looked, and in heaven a door stood open." And then what happens is that we are then invited, like the church is gathered, and all of a sudden there's this door that opens up in heaven, and we are invited through it to have a look at what's going on in heaven, and that we're invited in. And then it starts describing this scene, and this scene of divine worship. And so the idea is the door opens and it's saying, okay, now we're all gathered up as the church. Let's go through this door and see what's happening. And so we go through the door, and then we have this majestic scene of heavenly worship. And it is at the same time evoking images from Ezekiel, from Isaiah chapter 6, and if you know where to find it, 1 Enoch 14. Just because Enoch is not in our Bible does not mean that it was that John of Patmos would have ignored it. In fact, John of Patmos pulled in all kinds of literature with this. So we have these scenes of heavenly worship coming in. We also have the image of the throne. Okay. So at once I was with the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne with one seated on the throne. You know, and you're kind of assume that whoever is sitting on that throne is God, but curiously not enough, not described. We know who that is, but it's not described. And it's this, and then there's this rather elaborate description, like this rather elaborate description of it using jasper and carnelian, and around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Sort of interesting. And of course, rainbow, the image from Noah's Ark. And around the throne are 24 thrones, and 24 elders dressed in white robes with golden crowns on their heads. Then lightning flashes and all kinds of things going on here. But the idea is that it's reminding us who's in charge. So again, we have this heavenly throne room, and the idea is that it's pulling in and evoking sources from all sorts of different traditions. For example, the four living creatures, and these are reflections of from Isaiah 6, but mixed in terms of the aspects of created life: predator, prey, human, birds of the air. These kinds of images. And here's the other thing: the sea is like crystal. And this is an important image to pay attention to, because we come back to it towards the end of the book. One of the things that we don't fully appreciate, because largely we come from especially a lot of North American culture, like we are much more diverse than we were, but both French and English cultures were mariner cultures, as were the Spanish. The great powers themselves were, that conquering the seas. Like we even have like a lot of the hymns that we have. In fact, there's this enjoyment of the water and the sea. Hebrew culture didn't see it that way. In fact, the sea was a terrifying place. In fact, all the language, if you read of it, is that the sea itself, roiling and waving and filled with all kinds of creatures, is the embodiment, the complete embodiment of chaos itself. And what you have here is the sea, but it's like crystal. In other words, it's there, but it's completely under control. There's not a ripple on it. It's completely under control. And so that's what that image is implying, is that it's the bringing chaos itself into and under order. Thunder and the lightning, the rainbow, these images from Noah's Ark, among others. that we have these all these images in this. It's rather majestic. And then there is this on the throne. There's a scroll, and someone says, "Who is worthy?" Then I saw at the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll and written on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and to break its seals?" And no one on heaven or on earth was able to open the scroll or look into it. And I began to weep bitterly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or look into it. Then one of the elders said, "Hey, cheer up." And what you get is this wonderful buildup of the do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so he can open the scrolls, and it's open the scroll and its 7 seals. Okay, and so we have the seals on the scroll. Each of the 7 seals can be opened, and you're told this Lion of Judah. So we've got this image, like C.S. Lewis leaned into this Aslan, in terms of the great, big, powerful lion. And then almost immediately after this description, you're expecting this big, huge lion to come strolling to the scene. And what do you get? You get a lamb. And a lamb shows up. But here's the interesting thing, is that you have this big buildup, this dramatic entrance, and the very first place in Revelation where the word lamb is gets used, the lamb. And yet the word, unfortunately, here we don't really get a sense of how this works. Is that big buildup, huge lion, you're expecting a fierce predator, and instead what happens is you get this cute, fluffy little lamb show. Okay. In Greek, the word is arnaion, which curiously enough, it's not just a lamb, but it has a modifier in the Greek word that makes it even more vulnerable than it already is. The best possible English translation that you can come across is lambikins. So you get this kind of cute, fluffy plush toy showing up, and that is the one who is able to open the scroll. David, you've got your hand up, but you are muted.
Yeah, I know I'm muted, but no, I'm not. So I am trying to figure what you meant about anticipation, lion, which is on, and then appearance of the lamb. Like, is there anticipation of this huge, ferocious animal, but it never appears, and instead a lamb appears? Is that what happens?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Like the idea is that builds up this expectation of this powerful predatory beast, and instead what John Patmos ends up seeing and describing is a lamb, and a tiny one, like a little cute, fluffy, not much more than a plush toy kind of thing. And the idea is that God at God's most vulnerable is more powerful than anything the world can throw at it. That's ultimately where that is pointing. And so and for example, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this, but one of the most offensive images that I've actually seen, largely coming from the evangelical set, is a very buff, like Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of build Jesus on the cross, ripping the cross apart, like pulling forward and the cross busting. That is the absolute opposite of what's trying to be here. Is that like what you're trying to convey is that in this weakness and vulnerability is where we find God's power, not through some sort of macho male fantasy. And that's and here in Revelation, it's the Lamb, the vulnerable one. And so, but like Lambykins, that whole plush toy thing, I mean, it's accurate, but it's probably a little too cutesy for Revelation. But the idea is the conveyance of vulnerability. And so what we have here also is this image of worship. Chapters 4 and 5 is this element of divine worship, is that the idea is that the throne, Lamb, this sense of universal worship, the prayers of the saints. Also, we have these bowls of incense, which come back a little later on. Incense is used in worship. Now, for those of you from a Roman Catholic background, I'm looking at you, Richard, is that incense, like we don't use incense in a United Church setting. We never have. And in many respects, many Protestant churches actually have signs up saying, please don't wear perfume. We don't do scents here. And the idea is that incense in and of itself is worshiping God with all of our senses. And incense was commonly used, and in many worship traditions is still commonly used as an act of worship, both symbolic of the smoke rising as prayers to heaven, but it also engages not just your eyes, your ears, and your mouth as like the visuals in worship, what you hear in worship, what you taste through communion, but you're also using your nose. So it's engaging all of your senses. So it's used in a worship context here. All of creation is worshiping God.
Mhm.
And the idea is that chapters 4 and 5 is setting the scenes for when we have the seals the seals being opened, the trumpets, and the bowls being poured out. So before we move on, any questions with that? Like it's clear as mud. If you don't get all of it, just hopefully some of the larger picture will do. One of the things with this is that we're dealing with the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. All of these, the reason that they are chosen is that these are all images of opening, of announcing, or revealing. Okay, so when you crack a seal, it's opening, and the idea is you crack a seal and unfurl it, and then look inside the and see something. You blow a trumpet, it announces something. And bowls, you're pouring out its contents, revealing its contents. David.
Yes, all of these have the number 7 attached to them.
Yes.
Okay, I don't remember. I just don't know why that is so.
Well, seven. Like if 3 is the number of heaven and 4 is the number of earth, it's to represent the totality of heaven and earth.
Oh,
yeah.
David, when you did your sermon on Sunday,
yes.
did you not notice the 7 and 4 that was in there?
After I made my
Because I was like, oh man, I got it. And it was all because John had done it 2 weeks ago.
I know, that was so funny.
Well, and in the same way, like so, 7 is 3 plus 4, and 12 is 3 times 4. So specifically, you're dealing with the totality of heaven and earth. And of course, you just mentioned in a sevenfold pattern, and the idea is that these images are actually what are called synchronous. In other words, it isn't a case of you go through all 7 and then you move on to the next set and then you move on to the next set. The idea is that these are all sort of synchronous, the representative of different viewpoints of the same thing happening at the same time. But of course, because we are naturally linear beings following the arrow of time, we can't necessarily experience all of that happening at once. We've kind of got to read through it. And so think of this about going as laps, going through the same thing, is that each of the series are a retelling of the same pattern. And if you look, there are parallels. So, in fact, let's let's take a look at that. So what we have now, before we get into this, because this is where we kind of get a little bit more into some of the individual images, and we can, with the time that we have, we can actually stop and talk about some of those individual images. But the idea is that then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures call out as with the voice of thunder, "Come." And you know that you have the sequence of events, and if you look, there is a parallel of poetry to each seal. Like in the same way that you have the 7 days of creation back in Genesis, there's a repeated pattern, and so you have a white horse, a bow, crown, the one who conquers. You know, I looked and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. It's just short little line. That's basically that's pretty much one verse. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come," and out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permanent to take peace from the earth. And you have, notice we're getting horses here.
Hmm. 4 horses.
Okay. And sword, no peace, basically war. Then you have a black horse with scales of balance and famine. And curiously enough, if you remember the stories from Joseph, back in Genesis, that there is a bit of an evocation of some of those images from there. Keep in mind, you know, Revelation has about 500-ish verses and has 750 references to the Old Testament. So every single verse you can double up. You can almost double up on it. But you have, and then pale horse.
Yes. Yeah. No.
And death in all of its forms. Basically, this is where the image of, you know, death being one of the, like, these are the so-called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse here. And you know, we can have and layer some images on this. It is if this seems to evoke different images in certain other mythologies, it may actually do that. So let's continue on to seal number 5. We have this the martyrs who are under an altar going, "Hey, how long are we going to be down here?" You know, which is a really weird image. You know, it's kind of like all of a sudden here's an altar, and I looked underneath it, and no, there's the hey, you know, bud, when are we going to be done? Just hold your horses for a second. And then there is an earthquake, and we have this let's see where it has. Open the 6th seal, and I looked, and there came a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth, and the moon became like blood. Now we do actually have modern like astronomical phenomena that actually happens. Solar eclipses and lunar eclipses do that. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth, and as the fig tree drops its winter fruit as shaken by a gale. There are like so many images unpacked on that. But also, remember when I said way back when, think inside the globe, that in this time, people generally believed that if you shook the earth hard enough, stars would fall, because they're just attached to the ceiling and they come off their hooks and fall. So like that actually, you know, the connection between earthquakes and stars falling is it actually makes sense. Doesn't to us, but it does here. It makes sense in the context. And it said the sky vanished like a scroll rolling itself up, and every mountain island was removed from its place. And then what we have here, in this sense of the sixth scroll, and we have things being essentially unraveled, or reality itself is unraveling in many respects. Then we have this interlude and the so-called sealing of the 144,000, which Jehovah's Witnesses do take quite literally. And yet what you have here is this sense of essentially the idea of the gathering of the faithful. After this, I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds of the earth, so that no wind could blow, or any sea, or any tree. I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to damage the earth and sea, saying, "Do not damage the earth as a tree until we have marked the servants of our," basically making sure, make sure that everybody's okay. This is what's called an interlude, and in this there's this pausing, and you actually have this the tribes. The symbolic tribes of Israel. Keep in mind, everything here is symbolic. Nothing here is literal. Okay. But you have these 144,000. Well, how do we get to 144,000? Well, 1,000 usually means a lot, and 12 times 12. You get to 144. And so you have 12,000 from one tribe, 12,000 from another tribe, and going through all 12 tribes. And then then you have the sealing. And then after this, I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne, before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands, cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who's seated on the throne and the Lamb." Basically, it's almost like, the seals are being opened, and then we get a view back in the divine throne room. But everybody is there. And then of course, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Of course, if you've listened to Handel's Messiah, Handel spent a lot of time in Revelation when he wrote the Messiah. And then after this interlude, we have this, then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these robed in white?" Okay, those who have survived, who have come through this. These are words of encouragement. So you have these seals and everything being open, things get kind of progressively worse, and all of a sudden you get this kind of odd celebration, and then this, in essence, this glimpse of hope, of divine hope of the future, or not some of this divine hope that ultimately God is ultimately in control. Maybe, and then we get back into, after this interlude, that the interlude itself is basically all of chapter 7, and then we get into the last seal is open, and then we get silence. Again, if you're kind of wondering where some of these images come from, you also have Elijah. When Elijah's like not having a good day, goes up the mountain, flees, and God says, why are you here? And then God puts on this demonstration, and God isn't in all the flash. God is present in the silence. There's that, again, multiple references. And then in chapter 8, once you're kind of past that section, I mean, I realize I'm kind of glossing over some of this, because if we're going to deal with every single image, we would be here for a very long time. And I'm trying to get through this. We then go back, and then we have the trumpets. Now, what I want you to do is pay attention to the parallels
Mhm.
to the trumpets. That we have this hail of fire, and the first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were hurled to the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Does have that element parallels. Don't quite pay attention to that, but you have those kind of parallels. Fiery mountain, we have again the red. One of the third of the seas turn to blood. Then we have the bitter rivers, parallels to famine. A third of the heavens, lights dimmed, and the eagle, what we call the woe eagle, which is now number 4. Fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so the third of their light was darkened. A third of the day was kept from shining, likewise the night. And I looked, and I heard an eagle cry with a loud voice as it flew in heaven, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth," at the blast of the other trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow. In other words, we have effectively 4 being inflicted upon the earth, and then we have demon locusts, human suffering. Again, how long are we going to suffer? And then we also have the demon. Then we have this. Where are we here? These different woes come up.
But the locust.
Yep. And then we have let's see, the demon cavalry. Where are we here?
Locust and then the horses.
Yeah. And then, but we have these hymns, and like keep in mind the images that are coming out of this are very similar, are echoing Exodus. And then we have this interlude, a little scroll. I'm not sure, and we have this odd image where he's given where are we here?
Well, confused.
No, I'm moving over here. Yeah, and we have here. Then the voice that I had heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, "Go, take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angels who is standing at the sea on the land." So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll, and he gave it to me. He said, "Take it and eat it, and it will be bitter to your stomach, but sweet as honey in your mouth." So I took the little scroll in the hands of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when he had eaten it, my stomach made me bitter. The eating of the scroll is a symbol from Ezekiel. That Ezekiel was probably early, what we call early apocalyptic. It sort of some of his writings sort of developed the style that in Ezekiel you had a lot of symbolic imagery in and of itself, and one of those images early on in Ezekiel, he has this image of he's given a scroll, and he physically eats a scroll. The idea that the word of God is now in him, that he's eaten the word of God, and then he can speak it. That's what it means. And at least for Ezekiel, it tastes sweet when he does that. Whereas here you have that image from Ezekiel. There's something else layered on top of, which I'm not entirely sure what is, but there's a bitterness, and perhaps of the task that he has. And then then you have these kinds of images that are on that. And then then at the same time, there's the interlude. This interlude continues, and then you have the seventh trumpet. The end is announced and celebrated. So what you have here is you actually have parallels going on to each other. Think of it this way. It's like looking at the same set of events from different perspectives, not two different cycles of events, but rather, different cosmological the perspectives. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to jump from there into the bowls, but that doesn't, those images, we pick up again in chapter 16. So all of a sudden we jump from chapter 12 all the way up to 16, because there's this interlude, really a large interlude, which is what we're dealing with next week. But we're going to go to the other side of this and think of it like this. What we've had is basically brackets around what the core message is going to be, and that's for next week. We're going to jump to chapter 16, where the bowls come into play. And so similarly, we have these bowls get poured out and their contents revealed. And we have the sores, we have seas to blood, everything dies. Curiously enough, that, again, parallels. Rivers turn to blood, parallel to Exodus. The images are bizarre. Let's not get around that. But the thing is, it's doing these callbacks all throughout it to bring back to Exodus, and the ultimate, and one of the reasons why Exodus specifically is ultimately at the end of it all, of all that nastiness, the people were free. And that's the one thing to remember with Revelation. At the end of all that nastiness, the people are free. And and you also have, again, parallels here. Darkness, parallel to Exodus. The kings of the east, parallels here to the demon cavalry, and the famous preparation for the battle on the plains of Megiddo. And that's where you get the name Armageddon. Is basically a battle on the plains of Megiddo. But curiously enough, unlike the other ones, there's no interlude here. The interlude for the bowls we've already handled, and that's actually chapters 12 through 15. And we're gonna come back to that next week, because the masterpiece of Revelation is right in there. And then we have at the end the fall of Babylon. And Babylon, of course, we explored that symbol, and then there's the transition at the end of that transitions into part 3 of God's redeeming of the city, or the redeeming of the cosmos. And that's where these parallels come in. And we have so for example, in where are we here? Fallen is Babylon the Great. I mean, in essence, and keep in mind, Babylon here is a metaphor for Rome or external imperial powers. The idea that every empire falls.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as I said, the idea, like the imagery in Revelation is very, very, very dense. And all of these images here themselves are references to something else, meant to pull all these kinds of things in. And what I'm trying to do is help you catch some of the ones that would be a little bit more obvious. For example, the rainbow, Noah's Ark, the darkness, even the rivers to blood, being the echoing the signs and wonders from Exodus. But in addition to that, and we're going to get into this more next week, John of Patmos is not just using biblical images, he's also pulling in references to Greco-Roman mythology as well, some of which we will catch, a lot of it we won't, because we've completely lost that context. I mean, and the thing is, people who study classics might read that and say, well, that sounds a lot like this particular the Greco-Roman myth, but that can't possibly be it because it's in the Bible. Well, next, that's going to be my teaser for next week. We actually get to explore the influence of one very specific story from Greek mythology that is absolutely present in that is very present in chapter 12, 12 through 13 it is particularly. And so if that is there, then there has to be other the references to the common pop culture that are simply lost to us. And as long as we kind of get the broad framework, we don't necessarily get into necessarily all those individual details. Because I think if we make the assumptions there, then we're actually we're getting to the point of presuming we know how to play hockey when we don't. To go back to that original metaphor that I had. Now let's see. So I just want to kind of back this up a little bit. Any questions at this point? I realize this one's pretty intense, and it's just kind of like, all right, I've just gone through this kind of cycle here. Were there any things here like, okay, David, like this is now stick up your hands time because we do have time.
Well, there's a lot of things I could say here. I was listening to a documentary on what was happening between the age of bronze and iron,
Mm-hmm.
which was I don't know if it was last night, a few nights ago, by somebody named Richard Miles, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Thought it was very interesting, and a number of things occurred to me when I was, when you were speaking about, well, for instance, number 7, fall of Babylon. At that time, there was a huge transition between those two ages. When peoples came across the sea, and they were simply known as the sea people.
Yeah.
And so it was over and over again, we've seen through history, civilizations come and go in waves. And then coming back to number 7 there under bowls, where it's telling you that, well, is happening. That's what happens. But if the kingdom of heaven is going to be different than anything else, so it won't fall.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the things, like, curiously enough, yes, you're absolutely right. That the hope that the kingdom, the commonwealth of, like, depending on your language, the kingdom, the commonwealth of heaven will not fall. But curiously enough, when we get into next week, one of the cautions is that when a earthly power tries to assume that mantle of the realm that will not fall, it can bring you to some very dark places. For example, the most infamous in the past century is the Thousand-Year Reich.
The 1,000-year what?
The Thousand-Year Reich, Hitler's Nazi Germany.
Oh, okay, yeah, got
You
it.
know, will never fall. The idea is that there were some like the trouble is the religious makeup of Nazi Germany was actually much more complex. But there were some that were using that kind of language to describe the aspirations and assumptions of what Nazi Germany would be, as opposed to and so it's the dangers of when an earthly power tries to make that assumption, as opposed to, in essence, participating in what God has done, rather than trying to establish, like to take it for ourselves, so to speak. Christian nationalism, for example, not just in the States but in Canada, that's a more like it's been around for a while, but it is another example of the dangers of trying to kind of claim that for one's self, because one then turns into a terrestrial empire. But I'm leaning a little bit into next week. But the whole idea of this is that in essence, what you have is the sequence, like the sequences of 7 that are themselves increasingly like opening a seal, revealing just a little bit more, trumpets announcing just a little bit, each themselves announcing a little bit more. And is, in essence, what these are doing is all of this is actually a setup for the core revelation in chapters 12 through 15. And that's again, that's next week. And then the bowls on the other side of that are the bracket on the other side of that bring us out of it. So the idea is that we're doing this to reveal bringing in. Then we have the core revelation, and then the bowls, basically as they're poured out, then basically close that off and move into the ultimate hope that we will get to in 2 weeks. Clear as mud?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
But back there, say angel blew the trumpets, and
Yes.
then they talk about, and it poured down into a bottomless pit.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the furnace and darkness and the
Mhm.
locusts. And
Yes.
and that we have locusts coming. Well, we do have locusts now too. Does this mean that, yeah, how does this?
Well, now keep in mind, everything is metaphorical.
Yeah.
Everything is metaphorical. So so what you have is that, like, for example, the first bowl soars, that's a parallel to the plague of the sores from Exodus. Locust is also an image from Exodus, but there's another layer image, something else layered on top of it, which in and of itself may actually have more parallels in Greek mythology, as well. I mean, it's trying to pull out and mix and match a whole lot of different images together. And so keep in mind, our brains will try and fit this into something that we know and can be tangible. Okay, this must mean that locust plague over there that happened a couple of years ago. No, try not to get trapped into that. The idea is that it's evoking images of suffering that also are leading towards something of hope. But none of these images are literal.
Well, isn't that what's happened with a lot of religions, where they zero in and take a certain passage and that's gospel and that's the way it is?
Have you ever seen Monty Python's The Life of Brian?
No.
I'm seeing a couple of hands over there. There's this one point where this poor hapless, the central character in there is people mistake him for Jesus, and they start chasing him around, and he drops a shoe and he drops something else, and they pick up, this must be like, it's the holy shoe or the holy gourd of Jerusalem, and the whole group just breaks off and goes in different directions. That people kind of latch on to things and then kind of and run in certain directions. There was an actual schism over the interpretation as to what kind of plant Jonah sat under in chapter 3 of this tiny little book, where he's pouting of that Nineveh didn't get blown up. And there were people debating as to whether or not it was this type of plant or this type of plant. And and like mind you, this was also happened to be in the era of the infamous how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. So in that sense, it's not surprising, but we will tend to kind of latch on to certain things and run with it, as opposed to trying to say, let the images just affect us emotionally. I mean, demon locust, that's it's supposed to be, that is supposed to be like a dark and foreboding, like it's supposed to be a troubling image. I'm not going to say that these things are kind of like happy joy. I mean, Revelation is not. It's acknowledging the present suffering, and ultimately that God is in control. So it is, it's acknowledging that our current reality sucks, pardon the language, I guess, and that but ultimately where we're going, we have in the last of each of the bowls is that ultimately God's presence and love is revealed. I mean, in particular in the interludes between 6 and 7 in the seals and trumpets, give you these little nuggets of hope on the way, whereas the bowls don't necessarily have to do that, because it immediately launches into the really hopeful stuff in the book. I mean, if you look at the lectionary readings that we have with Revelation, most of the readings that we have that appear in our lectionary stick around chapter 4, chapter 7, which is in that interlude, in this interlude here, about wipe away every tear. It's this passage of hope, and then it jumps into basically from chapter 21 and 22, like at the end. Our lectionary does not touch all the messy stuff in the middle, because one, most of our like I know colleagues who are afraid to touch it. And that and I mean, some of we're going to get into some more specifics of the imagery. Then we're going to kind of come back and take a lap at it. Ultimately what I want to do is try and set the frame in, and especially when we get back to what chapters 12 through 15 next week, and we really get into the meat of it, is to then come back and reread it from beginning to end. And maybe we can start hearing some of those things a little bit better on the way through. So now I can go back and talk a little bit more, but I just want to talk about prepping for next week. Is that next week the theme is called pulling back the curtain. It's kind of like, okay, now that we've acknowledged the world around us, we are pointing towards hope, but now let's take a step back, and we're going that we're going to pull the curtain back. I mean, that is what apocalypse means, is to reveal what's behind the curtain. And so the chapters 12 through 15 is the pulling back of the curtain, but you have, you know, what we did this week is the artistic, yeah, like if you've ever been to it, have you ever been to a show where, in essence, there's kind of a pre-show that's in front of the curtain, and then at the main show, the curtain pulls back. In essence, what we've had is the pre-show, and then the main show is next week. So what I want you to do is I want you to read chapter 12 through 15 and then compare it to the images that you've seen in chapters 4 and 5. So the other thing that I focused a lot on the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls this week, or at least we put a lot of emphasis. But going back to the images of the divine throne room from chapters 4 and 5, if there's parts of Revelation that are more pleasant to read, chapters 4 and 5 is very majestic. And you have this, and so, but part of it is going back and kind of comparing those images, because what will start to happen is you'll start to see repeated patterns through it.
Okay.
And the other thing is that how many of you like political cartoons? Okay. And so one of them is, well, there is a website that has been functional for quite some time, put together by Daryl Cagle, who's a political cartoonist, who actually has this repository of political cartoons. And choose a political cartoon that speaks to you. And if you like, find it and email me the link and tell me why it speaks to you. And the nice thing about now, granted, a lot of the stuff that is on Daryl Cagle's site are mostly American, but they're not exclusively American. There are some Canadian artists on there. There are some New Zealand. There's, you know, Australian, New Zealand, as well as political cartoonists from various places, whether in Africa or the Middle East. So there is a fair bit of diversity there. But see how they use images, and just for the fun of it, go check it out. And the thing is, sometimes you may look at them, like, particularly if it's a political cartoon from a different country and not one that we have a lot of contact with, you may find the images a little weird. Whereas if it's something that's a little closer to home, it might be more familiar. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, Ian, I saw you wave your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I get stuck with the post-apocalyptic imagery. I have seen the symbols of our culture come crashing down from the skies on 9/11. I worked there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also seen the sun rise in the morning, knowing that the world still continues on.
Yep.
It's a different world. I've seen the rivers of burning oil in the sands, mostly by the Desert Storm. Yep. And I've also seen the birth of a child. So it gets really interesting to see the different symbolisms that we're discussing in Revelation.
Yeah, well, curiously enough, as horrifying as a river of blood might sound, I will say, having witnessed the birth of all three of my children, there is a river of blood involved in the birth of a child.
Yeah.
And but it's also there. There is one book that I find that I found very helpful. It's actually by one of the professors at Vancouver School of Theology where I taught, I went. Harry Meyer is an expert in apocalyptic literature, and he wrote a book a good number of years ago called Apocalypse Recalled. And the idea is Apocalypse Recalled wasn't like it was being that it isn't going to happen. He used Revelation to talk about people's experiences, specifically his parents and his extended family's experience of the Second World War being an experience of end time, like very, very much end times, like very few of us have I mean, I was born let me do the math, about 25 years after the end of the is it 25 years? I even have to pull out a calculator and do that.
After. We have, so yeah, roughly 25 years after the end of the Second World War, 24-ish. So a full generation afterwards. I have buried people, in fact, there was a gentleman in the congregation that I served in Calgary who was a casualty at Dieppe. Now, not obviously not a fatality, but he was a tanker captured on the shores at Dieppe. And you have this living memory of people who went through this. And of course, in your experience, because of course you were I imagine you saw the darkened skies of the broken oil, of the burning oil wells.
And then I've also seen that the trees have returned to color now.
Yeah.
So you have to try to reconcile things in your mind when you see stuff like this. It's very difficult.
Yeah. And
no doubt to us in our mind at the time when we saw the burning oil fields or the buildings come crashing down, people are looking around and you ask them what, and they said, we're listening for the hooves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, incident, Boney M did a pretty good job of Psalm 137. And the fourth rider, the Pale Rider, that was a pretty good movie too.
Sorry, you blanked, at least for me, you kind of blanked out there when you mentioned about the Pale Rider.
The fourth rider is the Pale Rider.
Yeah,
they made a movie with that featured in it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I mean, the thing is, the images are certainly very evocative. Now,
very true.
What we covered today are images that you're probably less likely to find in our hymnals. Let's be honest. But certainly the image of when you hear the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Well, that's the first four seals that are there, and we've like in fact, I don't know if any of you have seen on Amazon, Good Omens, that the four horsemen of the apocalypse actually show up, and as part of that. So, but anyway, we're at our close for tonight. And were there any, or at least we're at the end of the end slide. Were there any other questions or comments that you might have had?
That was a comment. That was very well done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also, I'm really looking forward to reading that interlude.
Yes. Well, the brilliance of Revelation you know, like what we get to cover next week is you actually get, I actually get to describe, and I'm looking forward to this, of how there's the brilliance of the language, and maybe it just, hopefully you can get an appreciation for it. And I will admit, we could have probably spent an entire week, like 4 weeks alone, just dealing with what we covered tonight. And so, like, I did move through it fairly quickly, and I do apologize for that, but I've been, in many respects, these are setups to the core message of the core message of Revelation, of what we're trying, of what we're. It's not so much the hopeful part of the message, but it's pulling back the curtain on it, and some brilliant use of language. And we get to have a little bit of fun with that next week. So, all right. So that's it. That's it for tonight. And thank you everyone for coming. I have, this is still recording, so once I'll have it processed, and then tomorrow morning I will upload it.
Pulling back the curtain, I can't help it, but I'm thinking of the Wizard of Oz.
Yes. And you know what? You're not far off. We are pulling back the curtain, and actually that Wizard of Oz imagery, hold on to that, because there is something to that will help your understanding of what happened, of what we cover next week. So anyway, thank you everyone, and we will, as far as this is concerned, I will see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yep.
Mm.